What happens when a tough, battle-hardened cop, used to bending the rules, suddenly faces his worst nightmare? A new boss who's about to turn his world upside down, and he doesn't even know it yet. Before we dive into this story, if you're passionate about justice, accountability, and powerful real-life tales, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you'll never miss another impactful video like this one. Share this with your friends and let's spread the message of change together. Now, let's jump into today's story. In the heart of a small, quiet town, a confrontation is about to unfold that will change the lives of everyone involved. The courtroom is filled with anticipation, a sense of unease hanging in the air. A seemingly routine case will ignite a chain of events that will bring to light long-standing issues within the Montello Police Department. At the center of this storm is Officer Rick Harding, a seasoned veteran who has spent over 15 years patrolling the streets of Montello. Proud of his legacy, Harding is used to handling matters with authority and control, but today is different. Today, he's about to face a woman who will completely alter his world. Cassie Monroe, the town's new police chief, who just so happens to be sitting in that courtroom. What Rick doesn't know is that Cassie is about to take charge in ways he never imagined. His rigid sense of duty, filled with bitterness and skepticism, will be tested by the very force of leadership he never expected to encounter. When Cassie Monroe arrives at the courthouse, disguised as a quiet observer, no one knows she is there to take over the reins of the Montello Police Department. She has been sent to reform a force known for its corruption and mismanagement. As the story unfolds, Harding's anger and frustration will meet with the calm but resolute determination of the new chief, leading to a showdown that will expose the truth behind years of misdeeds within the department. Rick's actions in the courtroom have already set the stage, but what he doesn't know is that his collision with Cassie Monroe will be far from the courtroom's end. Instead, it's only the beginning of a battle that will reshape the department and their lives forever. As tensions rise, Harding's past will be held against him in the light of truth, exposing the systemic issues in the Montello Police Department. Cassie's leadership, though new, will start making waves, but the battle between accountability and resistance will be fierce. Will Harding change, or will the department's culture of corruption continue to hold sway? Stay with us as we witness this dramatic turn of events unfold. It was the kind of day where the air held a charged weight, the kind of day where you could feel something was brewing but couldn't quite put your finger on it. In the small town of Montello, New York, everyone knew that change was coming, but no one could have predicted how fast things would spiral out of control. The Sullivan County Courthouse stood tall and imposing in the heart of the town, a symbol of law and order, yet also a silent witness to the undercurrents of power that had been running unchecked for years. The courthouse had seen it all. The petty disputes, the political wrangling, the emotional custody battles, but what was about to unfold that day would be nothing like the town had ever experienced before. Officer Rick Harding was a veteran of the Montello Police Department, a man who had served his town for over 15 years. He was part of the old guard, a second-generation cop who had inherited his father's badge and, some would argue, his father's biases. Rick was used to the grind. He knew the routine. He didn't need to be a part of the gossip around the department to understand how the system worked. He had seen it firsthand. He had learned, perhaps too well, how to deal with the people who lived in his town. The criminals, the troublemakers, and most importantly, those who dared to challenge his authority. But today, he was facing something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the routine case he thought he'd be testifying in. No, today, Officer Harding would face a woman who had the power to upend everything he thought he knew about law enforcement. She had the power to tear down the walls that he had spent years building around himself. This woman, who had arrived quietly under the radar of the local media, was about to reveal herself as something far more significant than anyone in Montello could have anticipated. Her name was Cassandra Monroe, or Cassie as she liked to be called, and she had been appointed the new chief of police for Montello. She had arrived only the night before, dressed in a sharp gray suit, with her hair neatly pulled back into a stylish bun. She carried herself with the kind of poise and confidence that commanded attention, but she wasn't here for the applause. Cassie wasn't the type to flaunt her title or her power. She was here to do the hard work of fixing a broken system. A system that had been riddled with corruption, abuse of power, and a deep divide between the police force and the community it was meant to serve. But no one knew that yet. At least not Officer Harding. For him, Cassie was just another stranger in the courthouse. A curious woman, perhaps here on some sort of high-level consulting job. The rumors about a new police chief had been buzzing around Montello, but Rick hadn't paid much attention. He had more immediate concerns. His mortgage, his aging mother's medical bills, and the usual grind of his duties. Little did he know, the moment they locked eyes in that courtroom would set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could have imagined. Cassie Monroe was about to become his superior, and Harding was about to learn that his days as a cop, perhaps even his future in law enforcement, were hanging by a thread. A sudden confrontation. As Cassie entered the courtroom for the first time, she was careful not to draw attention to herself. She didn't want to disrupt the proceedings or stir up unnecessary curiosity. After all, she was here as a quiet observer, just someone trying to understand the current state of Montello's police department. But as she made her way to an empty bench near the back of the room, something caught her eye. There, seated among the officers, was Rick Harding, a man whose reputation preceded him. Rick had been a cop for so long that he had become a fixture of Montello's law enforcement landscape. He was one of those officers who believed in the idea of absolute authority, law and order as he saw it, not necessarily as it was written in the rulebook. He had a rough, no-nonsense attitude that some respected, but others feared. His relationship with the community was strained at best, and his quick temper was well known. Yet, despite his reputation, he was considered indispensable by many of his peers, which made him both untouchable and, to some, invincible. But Cassie Monroe wasn't intimidated by him. She didn't buy into the myth of invincibility that surrounded officers like Harding. In fact, it was precisely officers like him who she had been brought in to address. As Montello's new police chief, her job was clear: to rebuild trust between the police force and the community. And for that, she would need to confront the hard truths that many in the department had spent years ignoring. When Cassie approached Rick's bench and politely asked if she could sit down next to him, he barely glanced up. His eyes flickered over her once, dismissing her with a quick flick of the wrist, an unmistakable sign that he saw her as just another stranger in the crowd. There was no recognition, no acknowledgement of the power dynamics that were shifting around him. The shock of a lifetime. The morning passed in its usual manner, with cases being called and witnesses taking the stand. Rick was called up for testimony in a minor assault case, which seemed like just another mundane day in the courthouse. But as he took the stand, he had no idea that everything was about to change. Cassie, still sitting quietly in the back, could sense the tension in the room. Rick's testimony was as predictable as it was uninspired. He recounted the details of an altercation between two teenagers, offering his side of the story with unwavering confidence, as if his word alone was enough to seal the fate of the accused. But as the defense attorney began to poke holes in Rick's testimony, something shifted. Rick didn't like being questioned. It was clear in the way his face tightened, in the way his words grew sharper with every challenge. The defense attorney was making a valid point, questioning Rick's assumption that one of the teens was the clear aggressor. Cassie could see the discomfort in Rick's eyes, and it wasn't just the stress of the cross-examination. No, this was something deeper. Rick Harding had never had to answer for his actions, not like this. Cassie, who had seen this dynamic play out countless times before in her career, could feel the urgency rising in her chest. This wasn't just about a minor assault case anymore. It was about the very essence of accountability. As Rick's testimony crumbled under the weight of the defense's questioning, Cassie realized that the moment she had been dreading was finally here. She wasn't just going to be a witness to change in Montello. She was going to be the catalyst for it. The moment of truth. As the day went on, it became increasingly clear that the small-town courthouse was about to witness a confrontation like no other. In one corner, there was Rick Harding, his pride bruised and his ego hanging by a thread. In the other, there was Cassie Monroe, a woman who had spent years honing her skills as a leader, a reformer, and an advocate for justice. But Rick wasn't the only one about to be blindsided by the truth. Cassie was about to learn something that would challenge her own preconceived notions of what it meant to be a leader. The quiet, unassuming woman she had dismissed earlier in the day wasn't just any citizen. She was the new chief of police, and she was here to change the department, starting with Rick Harding himself. Their collision was inevitable. It was only a matter of time before Rick would have to face the consequences of his actions, and Cassie would have to face the reality of what it would take to turn Montello's police department around. The stakes were higher than either of them could have imagined. The rising tension, confrontation, and revelation. The clash between Officer Richard Rick Harding and Cassandra Cassie Monroe was no longer just a personal confrontation. It was the moment when two worldviews collided, setting the stage for a battle that would ripple through the entire Montello Police Department. As Cassie made her way to the back of the courthouse, where she could observe Rick from a distance, she couldn't help but feel a wave of mixed emotions. On one hand, there was the deep sense of duty she had carried with her for years, a duty to reform, to ensure accountability in law enforcement, and to rebuild fractured trust with the community. On the other hand, there was the undeniable weight of the task ahead of her. Rick Harding, an officer who had served this town for decades, and who had become emblematic of everything that was wrong with the department. This wasn't going to be a simple fix. Cassie knew it, the mayor knew it, and even Rick, in some way, knew it too. It was just a matter of when the inevitable confrontation would occur, and how devastating it would be for both of them. Rick's testimony in the assault case had been a textbook example of the kind of policing that Cassie was determined to change. His narrative of events was filled with the biases he had long cultivated, presenting his version of truth as the unassailable reality. He didn't understand the importance of questioning his own assumptions, and he had never had to. But today, the cracks in his hardened armor were starting to show. The video evidence, the unraveling of Rick's story. After Rick finished his testimony in the assault case, the defense attorney introduced damning evidence. Cell phone footage from the protest where Rick had been involved in Allison Green's arrest. The video, recorded by a bystander, showed a peaceful demonstration that Rick had violently interrupted. In it, Allison was shown standing still, chanting slogans, only to be suddenly tackled by Rick without provocation. Cassie's heart sank as she watched the footage. It was clear as day. The evidence contradicted everything Rick had said. His words were too polished, too rehearsed, designed to paint himself as the hero in a situation that now appeared far more complex. The video painted a different story, one where Rick was the aggressor, using force far beyond what was necessary. The difference between his version and what the video depicted was striking, and it was undeniable. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the defense pressed Rick on his inconsistencies. Rick's face grew red, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something to hold on to. He struggled to explain away the evidence, resorting to weak excuses about the video being misleading and the crowd's behavior being much more volatile than it appeared. But no one bought it. The cracks in his credibility were becoming wider and deeper with every word he spoke. The growing disconnect, Cassie's dilemma. As the defense attorney continued to cross-examine Rick, Cassie felt the weight of the situation pressing on her chest. She had been brought in to reform the department, but she hadn't anticipated having to confront such a blatant display of misconduct so soon. It was one thing to read about the issues in reports and hear about them secondhand, but it was another thing entirely to see them play out in front of her. The fact that Rick had been so cavalier in his approach to policing didn't just make him a problem for the department, it made him a liability. His blatant disregard for the community, his refusal to even consider that he might have made a mistake, was dangerous. For Cassie, the moment had arrived. She had to act, and act fast. This wasn't just about managing the department, it was about changing its entire culture. And that culture began with Rick Harding. However, as much as she understood the need for accountability, Cassie couldn't help but feel a flicker of sympathy for Rick. She knew what it was like to be entrenched in a system, to believe that your way of thinking was the only way. She had once been where he was too proud to admit that she might have been wrong, too caught up in the world of us versus them to see the bigger picture. But eventually she had learned. She had changed. And now it was Rick's turn. The courtroom fallout, the truth comes to light. As the trial continued, the prosecutor's questions became sharper, more pointed. Each one chipped away at the walls that Rick had built around himself. And when Allison Green took the stand, the truth was finally laid bare. Allison, the activist who had been brutally arrested at the protest, stood before the courtroom, her arm in a sling. She was composed, but the emotion was evident in her eyes. She described the peaceful nature of the protest, how she had simply been exercising her right to free speech when Rick had charged at her. She spoke about the pain and fear she had felt during the arrest, and the lasting trauma it had caused. "I wasn't attacking him," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was exercising my right to free speech, and he charged at me like I was a criminal." Her testimony resonated with the room. For the first time in the trial, the truth was no longer clouded by conflicting stories or biases. It was clear that Rick had overstepped, and in doing so, he had undermined everything that law enforcement was supposed to stand for: justice, fairness, and the protection of the public. Cassie watched from the back of the room, her heart heavy. She knew this case was just the beginning. It wasn't enough for her to simply hold Rick accountable for his actions. She needed to ensure that the entire department was held to the same standard. The work ahead of her was monumental, but it had to be done. The conflict escalates, the battle for control. The next day, the tension in Montello's police department was palpable. Officers who had once respected Rick were now forced to confront the truth of his actions. The town's faith in the police was shaken, and the pressure on Cassie to act decisively was mounting. Rick, however, remained defiant. He didn't believe he had done anything wrong. In his mind, he had followed protocol, and the community simply didn't understand the pressures he faced every day. The idea that he was being scrutinized by outsiders, people who had no idea what it was like to be on the streets, was something Rick couldn't accept. For Cassie, it was clear that the road ahead would not be easy. There were many who would resist her efforts to reform the department, and Rick Harding was just the beginning. But she was prepared for the challenge. She had faced difficult battles before, and she knew that real change took time. It wasn't just about enforcing new policies. It was about changing the hearts and minds of the officers who had been part of the problem for so long. The moment of truth, a courtroom reckoning. The day of the final ruling arrived. The Sullivan County Courthouse was packed with people, each holding their breath in anticipation of what the judge would say. The media had gathered, and local activists had turned out in full force, hoping for a decision that would set a precedent for accountability within Montello's police department. Judge Regina Walker entered the courtroom, and a heavy silence fell. Rick sat at the defense table, his body rigid with tension, his hands clenched in fists. Allison Green and her supporters sat on the other side of the room, their faces filled with quiet anticipation. The moment had come. The judge began reading her decision, and the room hung on her every word. The aftermath: rebuilding trust and finding justice. As the gavel fell with a resounding bang, marking the end of the trial, the tension in the Sullivan County Courthouse was thick enough to cut with a knife. The room buzzed with whispers, many of them excited, others anxious, but all filled with a sense of anticipation. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and now the consequences would unfold. Rick Harding's fate a crushing blow. The judge's ruling was a moment of justice for Allison Green and for those who had suffered under the weight of officers like Rick Harding. The judge's decision was unequivocal. Officer Harding had used excessive force and violated department protocols. His actions during the protest had been reckless, and his attempt to falsify reports only deepened his misconduct. Judge Walker did not mince words as she announced that Rick Harding would face disciplinary action, potentially including termination. In addition, the case was being forwarded to the district attorney for criminal charges related to falsifying official documents. For Rick, this was a bitter pill to swallow. He had served Montello's police department for 15 years, and in his mind, he had earned the right to operate with the autonomy that came with his experience. But his sense of entitlement, combined with his unwavering refusal to acknowledge the power of accountability, had led him to this crushing moment. As the courtroom erupted into hushed murmurs, Rick's face went white. His once confident posture slumped as he realized the gravity of the situation. His career, his identity as a respected officer was hanging by a thread. He sat there, frozen, as his lawyer attempted to object, but the judge's ruling was final. The weight of his actions, and his inability to accept responsibility, had brought him to this breaking point. Outside, the media were waiting, eager for their next soundbite, ready to pounce on the fall of another disgraced officer. The ripple effect, community and department reactions. As news of the decision spread, Montello erupted in a frenzy of emotion. For many, it was a long-awaited moment of justice. Activists, community members, and those who had been victimized by Rick's misconduct felt a wave of relief as they saw the power of their fight come to fruition. The words justice and accountability resonated through the streets as the activists celebrated what they saw as a victory for the oppressed, for the marginalized, and for those whose voices had been ignored for far too long. But the victory was bittersweet. Although justice had been served in this case, it highlighted a systemic issue that went far beyond the actions of one rogue officer. The revelations about Rick Harding had exposed a deep-seated culture of corruption within the Montello Police Department, a culture that Cassie Monroe had inherited as the newly appointed chief. Cassie knew that this moment, as important as it was just the beginning. The real work was just beginning, and it would take all of her skills, patience, and leadership to rebuild a department that had long been fractured. Back at the police station, the mood was heavy. Some officers stood in solidarity with Rick, unable or unwilling to accept the reality of his wrongdoings. Others felt the shifting tides, realizing that change was inevitable, whether they liked it or not. But even among those who were resistant to reform, there was a growing sense of unease. Rick's fall from grace had revealed just how fragile the status quo had become. The cracks in the department were visible to everyone now. Cassie stood at the front of the station, watching her officers file in for their morning briefing. She knew that the eyes of the town, of the media, and of her officers were all on her now. It was time for action, not just words. The reforms she had promised were not just ideals. They were necessities for the future of Montello. The department had to heal, and that healing would come through difficult conversations and decisive actions. A tenuous meeting. Cassie confronts Rick Harding. In the wake of the trial, Cassie knew it was inevitable that she would have to confront Rick Harding directly. His behavior had been unacceptable, but she wasn't about to write him off completely. Cassie believed in second chances, but that belief was tempered by the reality that accountability could not be ignored. She would have to lay the groundwork for a new way forward for Montello's police department, and that meant addressing Rick's actions head-on. The first confrontation came in the form of a brief encounter outside the courthouse. Rick, still processing the weight of the judge's decision, stood near the courthouse steps, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. It was in this moment that Cassie saw him clearly, for the first time, not as an officer of the law but as a man who had seen his own world crumble. Cassie approached him, her voice calm and measured. "Officer Harding," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I realize this is a difficult time for you, but this is the process. We can't ignore the evidence." Rick turned sharply to face her, his face twisted with bitterness. "You're just like the rest of them, aren't you?" he spat, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "You're just waiting for me to fail." Cassie's gaze never wavered. She had dealt with anger before, both her own and others. "I don't want to see any officer fired without cause," she replied. "But if the evidence shows misconduct, the department has to take appropriate action. That's our job. To uphold the law, not skirt it." Rick glared at her, his fists clenched, but for a brief moment, there was something in his eyes, something vulnerable, that caught Cassie off guard. It was gone just as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once again by his usual defiance. "I know what it's like on the streets," he muttered bitterly. "You have no idea what we go through every day." Cassie stood her ground, but deep down, she knew Rick wasn't just rejecting her leadership. He was rejecting a reality that no longer existed. He was part of an old guard, a generation of officers who thought they could operate above the law without consequence. And for years they had. But now everything was changing. "Maybe," Cassie said quietly, her voice filled with conviction. But we can't let the streets change us. We have to change them. Rick didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The transformation begins. Cassie's leadership in action. The road ahead for Cassie Monroe would not be easy. She had inherited a department rife with distrust, resistance, and a legacy of misconduct. But as she stood outside the courthouse, watching Rick fade into the distance, she knew that the transformation had already begun. The town had witnessed the fall of one of its longest-serving officers, and the ripple effects of that event would not fade away quickly. Cassie's job now was to ensure that the message of accountability and transparency was heard loud and clear. It wasn't enough to just address the immediate aftermath of Rick Harding's fall. She had to ensure that the entire police department underwent a cultural shift, one where officers understood the importance of serving the community with respect, not fear. Over the next few weeks, Cassie's leadership would be tested like never before. She introduced new community policing programs, started regular town hall meetings, and began the difficult work of holding officers accountable for their actions. The change was slow, but it was steady. And although not everyone in Montello agreed with the changes, one thing became clear. Cassie Monroe was a force to be reckoned with, and she wasn't going to back down. The future of Montello, a new era of policing. The future of Montello's police department was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it felt hopeful. Cassie knew that the challenges ahead would be many, but she was determined to see this journey through. She had come to Montello not just to be the police chief, but to be a symbol of change. In the weeks following Rick Harding's downfall, the town began to see the benefits of Cassie's leadership. Officers who once resisted change began to see the value in the new approaches. The community started to rebuild trust with the police, and though it was still a long road, it was a road that now seemed possible to navigate. As Cassie sat at her desk one evening, reviewing the progress of her reform initiatives, she took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. She had faced down her own demons, wrestled with her own doubts, and fought tooth and nail to prove that a better way of policing was possible. Montello had a long way to go, but Cassie Monroe was determined to lead it into a new era, one where accountability, fairness, and justice prevailed, no matter how many obstacles lay in her path. And as for Rick Harding, he had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power is abused and accountability is ignored. But even in his downfall, he had played a part in something much greater than himself. He had, in the end, helped usher in a new chapter for Montello. The road to reform was never easy, but with determination and the courage to stand up for what's right, even the most entrenched systems could be changed. Reflections on justice, accountability, and change. As Cassie Monroe looked out the window of her office, the sun dipping below the horizon, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. The work was far from over, but the winds of change were sweeping through Montello, and she was at the helm. The journey would be long, and the challenges would be immense, but she knew one thing for certain. Montello was on its way to becoming a place where justice, fairness, and accountability were no longer just ideals, but the bedrock of the community. Change was hard. Change was painful, but it was also necessary. And for Cassie Monroe, it was the only way forward.